Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Motorsport Speak, the podcast brought to you by Motorsport Monday and MotorsportWeek.com. My name's Dan Lawrence, and joining me today is Taylor Powling, and we're here to talk about the first sprint weekend of the 2025 Formula One season, which came at the Chinese Grand Prix, round 2 of this year's campaign. And it really was a tale of two halves. The first half of the story of China was a good one for Ferrari, with Lewis Hamilton getting his first pole and first victory in red in the sprint sessions before things turned on their head in favour of McLaren and Oscar Piastri, who got his first ever pole position in a Grand Prix and took his first win in China, the third of his young F1 career. Whereas Ferrari, well, we'll get to that. They came unstuck in rather dramatic circumstances. But first, Taylor, how are you? And did you enjoy the weekend's races?
Hi, Dan. I'm good, thank you. And I came into the China weekend with low expectations because I think particularly in the V6 era, it's not been an amazing track for racing, especially with the current cars, obviously last year and now this year. And that was realised, really. It wasn't a thriller. 2 races, pretty, tardy races, I'd say, in general. There wasn't much action going on. It was more of a, management, whoever had clear air managing their tyres. That was what it was centralised on. But in terms of the result, I think from a championship perspective, it was the ideal one because obviously Oscar Piastri in Australia had the mistake, the spin, dropped him to 9th, and already that opened up a 23-point lead. And I think we were saying at the end of the last podcast, it's really important that he hits back. And wow, did he hit back? He was absolutely imperious on Saturday and Sunday. And to got the point swing down to Norris down to 10 points in one go, that's massive for his title chances.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. We made our prediction, didn't we, last week, that it was going to be a bit of a romp for McLaren and a 30-second victory. I think that was our hot take, wasn't it? And in Norris's favour as well. But instead, McLaren were pegged back a little bit. I think obviously sort of front graining and front limited issues, and obviously the McLaren MCL 39 being a tricky car in terms of it's the quickest car, but especially on one lap it can bite. And Piastri fared better with it this weekend gone, whereas Norris obviously qualified 6th in the sprint, ruining mistakes. Piastri qualified 3rd, was able obviously to then recover to 2nd in the sprint race. Took pole in Grand Prix qualifying, whereas Norris aborted his final run, was only 3rd. So Norris obviously improved throughout the weekend, but he never quite got onto Piastri's level. And as you say, really sort of gave up some points to the Australian, which is vital in terms of the title fight, because it is kind of looking like it's going to be between those two guys. Obviously, we're at an early stage, and also Norris had that slightly poor start to the sprint as well, didn't he? Where he dropped back to 9th, and then he spent the entire 19 laps basically stuck behind Lance Stroll before a late pass got him 8th for that 1 point, which obviously really accounts for some of that point swing as well in Piastri's favour. But Piastri, just one of those weekends where he really sort of showed his best, similar to that Baku weekend where he was really strong. I think as well, really good to see him turn up in qualifying, because we know that that's a thing that he needs to improve at. And I think these two weekends have shown that he has, I think, made a significant improvement. He was very close to Norris in Melbourne, but beaten to pole, whereas in qualifying here, he really had the measure of Norris. And then, I think as well, Andrea Stella saying that there's a marked difference between Piastri at China last year, where I think he finished 8th in the main race, way down on Norris, who finished 2nd last year in the Chinese Grand Prix, obviously turning things around 12 months on to win. I guess painting an exciting picture, because as we're going to get on, the other teams don't quite have an answer yet for McLaren, despite them being pegged back a little bit in Shanghai.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned there, Piastri in China, I think the gap to Norris last year was about 40 seconds, give or take. He had damage as well, so that exaggerated the gap between the two, but it was definitely a weak, probably arguably you could say it's the weakest moment of Piastri's career in F1, because up until then, although Norris had the measure in race trim, I mean, Piastri had a strong start to his sophomore season. But that was, I think, a massive rude awakening. And Andrea Stella even said that he had a sit down with Oscar and they went through all the areas he was lacking. And to come back 12 months later, on only a second visit to the circuit and put down the statement that he did was really impressive. And, the momentum that he can carry now, because after Australia, it would have been very easy for him to, we saw it last season, I think, a few times. If he had a poor weekend, he could go anonymous for the following rounds, but to bounce straight back was just imperative, I think, both for his momentum, his confidence, and also the points table as well. But looking at it from a Norris perspective, yeah, I mean, it was kind of ironic that he came into the weekend saying that this McLaren car doesn't suit me, and that was really exposed in Shanghai. I mean, the circuit kind of induces understeer anyway, and the McLaren car characteristic just accentuated that. He said post-race that he was fearing that the race was going to be a genuine struggle, because obviously, as you mentioned, we saw in the sprint that he got bogged down behind Lance Stroll and couldn't get by for a good 18 or so laps. It was only right at the end that he managed to pip him to get the final point. And I mean, he came back really well as well, you have to say, because he believes he had the best race pace. Andreas Heller said he was saving his tyres for a late charge at Piastri. Would he have been able to mount an attack on his teammate? That remains to be seen, because obviously the brake pedal issue meant that he ended up clinging on for second. But yeah, I think it'll be an interesting subplot to track over the next few rounds, whether the McLaren car characteristics are a limitation on Norris's raw speed. He said post-race that he's got some answers to the problems that he had over the weekend, but if there's an intrinsic way this McLaren needs to be driven and it suits Piastri more, that could be a big point in the title battle. Piastri's smoother style, the McLaren, the traction of the McLaren means it likes to be smooth on the entry to really maximize that traction on exit, whereas Norris explained it heading into the weekend that his style's more attacking. He likes a car that's really strong on the nose, where he can attack the corner entries, and this McLaren, that's not compatible with his driving style. But he's, by the sounds of it, in the race in China, he managed to find some solutions. So I think Japan's going to be a really interesting weekend, just to see, is there a ceiling on Norris's potential with this car, and is it more tailor-made to Piastri's style? Because in both qualifying sessions this year, Piastri's been, as you say, a lot closer. But is that a gain he's made, or is it a combination of he's made strides, but Norris is also not operating at his maximum potential because the car's difficult to drive on the limit and it doesn't suit his driving style?
Yeah, I know. And also, it's interesting to point out, I guess, Piastri got a podium at Suzuka in his first season. So it's a track that, unlike China, it's not one that he's needing a vast improvement on. So we could see him again lay down a significant challenge to Norris in qualifying in the race, which is good, given that McLaren still looks comfortably like the fastest team. And it was, again, a case of rival outfits taking turns to sort of pick and prod at them this weekend in Shanghai, and in the Grand Prix, it was Mercedes and George Russell that were the ones sort of troubling McLaren, if that's a fair way of putting it. George obviously doing that incredible lap to get it on the front row and split the McLarens in Grand Prix qualifying, and then in the race having a brief moment where he managed to get back between them, obviously undercutting Norris only for a few laps, and then, as we said, the brake issue, the progressively longer and longer brake pedal that Norris was contending with at the end, which saw, I think, a 7-second gap shrink to about 1.3 seconds by the time that Norris and Russell crossed the line. Russell getting back-to-back podiums and showing that he's really there to pick up any scraps that McLaren are leaving behind, because obviously he got that podium in Australia as well. I think Toto Wolff said that he was operating at 10 out of 10 level, and Russell said it was one of his best weekends. Mercedes, I think, looking a lot better than they did last year. I think they know what they're doing with the car finally. It's not surprising them, which is good. The only thing that they can't do at the moment is match McLaren pound for pound. But a really strong weekend for Mercedes, I think, especially on Russell's side of the garage. Antonelli struggling a little bit more in the race, but due to lap 1 damage, presumably from the front wing end plate that went flying off of Leclerc's Ferrari. Started 8th, crossed the line in 8th, gained 2 positions from the spoilers Ferrari disqualification. But it looks like, I think, Russell's really leading the charge at Mercedes. And if they can get some improvements, I think he's going to be adding to his win tally as well.
Oh yeah, no, Russell's driving absolutely brilliantly at the moment, and it's a vital time for his career as well. I know, obviously, he's come through the Mercedes ranks, and Toto Wolff thinks highly of him, and it does look inevitable that a contract extension will be agreed at some stage, providing Max Verstappen doesn't become available. But George is certainly showing the Mercedes that he can lead the team, and that they don't need to resort to and trying to entice Verstappen into the camp. And he's actually doing Kimi Antonelli a massive favour, because weekends like Antonelli's just had, where a bit on the back foot, a bit anonymous, it's not really being brought to the attention because Russell's bringing the big points home, which is enough to keep Mercedes in that second position in the championship. The Mercedes car looks, out of, you have to say, the chasing pack, Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari, it looks the most consistent car. It certainly looks more benign than its rivals' cars. But the big question mark is, we've seen in stages Ferrari have that peak potential, which if they unlock it, they can trouble McLaren. With Mercedes, does that W60 and its current guys have that promise? Can it, can Russell rag it to the McLaren level? It could be one of those things where they built a car that's more benign, like Aston Martin have to a lesser degree, but the actual raw potential is not as high. But I think the main thing is they've actually got a base they understand now. So when it comes to adding upgrades, you're not trying to extinguish a load of fires because you've got problems reappearing from all different angles. They've actually they understand the car, and they can just focus on adding peak performance, which in this rule set hasn't been easy, because we've seen teams try to find those diminishing returns and actually running into more problems. So it'll be interesting to see whether Mercedes can solve that this season. But I have no doubts that if they build a car that can rival McLaren's, George Russell will be there to bring home the big results. He's driving absolutely fantastically, as I said, and definitely I think he's showing now the potential that we all thought he had. And if he can carry on this run where he's just quietly going about his business, maximising his results, avoiding the silly mistakes that he's made in the last few years, I think he's third in the championship. I know it's early days, but if Mercedes' initial upgrades, all they need to do, if Mercedes find a couple of tenths with their first upgrade package, like that summer upgrade last summer, all of a sudden Russell's in title contention. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that, he, with a teammate like Antonelli, who's not necessarily threatening his superiority in the team, if the two McLarens taking points off each other, who knows, we could see George in the title fight.
Yeah, I agree. And McLaren argue that their two drivers are a strength because they're learning from one another, but the fact remains is they're taking points off of one another, which isn't happening so much at Mercedes. There's been a nice buffer, and Russell's already proven in qualifying that he can take it to the McLarens. It's just he doesn't have the car that can do it over a whole race distance, because McLaren's crazy sort of tyre management in a race conditions, which the other teams really need to sort of match them on. But it's interesting you mentioned, obviously, with Ferrari. Ferrari has the peaks and troughs with its car, and its whole weekend just completely summarised, I think, what they have in the SF25 is they've changed the car because they feel like they had a limit with last year's package. They've got more potential with this one, but it is maybe tricky to find it. They found it on Friday and they found it on Saturday with Lewis Hamilton, and I think maybe people were surprised, given his difficulties in his debut weekend, getting to grips with Ferrari and acclimatising to a new team. He was leading the Ferrari charge, taking the pole in sprint qualifying, taking a assured victory, just managing that 19-lap stint. And Leclerc had to. It wasn't until the Grand Prix really that Leclerc turned the tables on Hamilton. But yeah, really, I think let's park the Ferrari bit there for now and talk about Lewis Hamilton. Obviously, I guess realizing some of the potential, not only of the car but of himself in red, with the pole and victory in the shorter element of the Shanghai weekend.
Yeah, that will be a big morale boost for Hamilton, just purely because obviously the Grand Prix didn't go as planned, and that was a consequence of he's still learning the team, he's still learning the car. He said he went in a set of direction that didn't pay dividends. If he had, if that there hadn't been the sprint sessions, and that was his weekend. Okay, out-qualified Leclerc, but then he ended up struggling in the Grand Prix and actually, ceded the position to his teammate. Then it'd be like another case of, what people like being very reactionary, talking about Ferrari making the wrong move, etc. But to have that sprint win, that was the highlight of his weekend. And so no matter what happened in the Grand Prix, he had that, his maiden win with Ferrari. And as I mentioned, I think that's a big confidence boost for him. It shows that, what he can do at this early stage of his Ferrari career. So imagine what he'll be able to achieve once he's dialed into the car.
Exactly. And I think he said yapping critics was what he said in his Parc Fermé interview. He was firing back out there or responding to, really, because it was a measured response, wasn't it, from him in the Parc Fermé interview. But good to see. Obviously, Parc Fermé opens up after the sprint ahead of Grand Prix qualifying, and Ferrari made changes, and Hamilton then later said those changes put the car on the knife edge and they found themselves on the third row. And in the race, they really weren't in the picture for the podium fight. Obviously, they're coming together at the start. Leclerc losing his front wing end plate. Hamilton then actually realising he didn't have the pace compared to Leclerc and asking for a swap to allow Leclerc to challenge ahead, which he tried to, but couldn't quite do the job on Russell, and then eventually falling into the clutches of Max Verstappen late on. And then things got worse for Ferrari, crossing the line 5th and 6th. Unfortunately, Leclerc's car was found to be a kilo underweight, and Hamilton's plank had excessive wear. So both disqualified. The highs and lows of being a tifosi, I think, for many fans out there, Italian or otherwise. Pretty poor way for their weekend to end. And again, it just, I guess, signifies that they're still finding their feet with this car. So, they're going to have the highs of the sprint win, but then they need to figure out really what went wrong with the changes in Grand Prix qualifying and the race itself, and not get disqualified.
I think the first protocol is to make sure you don't get disqualified. I mean, it's a bit concerning that I think I saw a stat earlier, whereas like Red Bull's last disqualification was Australia 2014 with Ricciardo. And Ferrari have had, I think, 3 under Vasseurs tenure now. And you can't just say it's bad luck. Ultimately, it is Ferrari's fault. It's bad preparation. And it might be irrelevant at the end of the season if they don't get, haul themselves back into title contention. But if they do, then like last year with that mid-season upgrade, they're going to be pinpointing this race as one where they lost out. It's just not good enough, really. I mean, we can sit here and joke about it, but it's the same old story with Ferrari. Nothing seems to be changing. And last year, especially towards the end of the year, it looked like they were getting their act together. It looked like Vasseur cultivated a team that, looked like a championship-winning outfit. That the upgrades, the way they bounced back from that mid-season slump, how they were working operationally, that they actually looked like a title-winning organisation. And yet, whatever's happened over the winter, Australia was an absolute calamity. This weekend, again, it does seem like the old Ferrari, and just when they look like they've turned a page, they just revert to the norm. And it's actually ironic. Hamilton's the elder statesman in the team, but from my point of view, it feels like he's the one that, he's very positive in the media because at the end of the day, he's at the start of this Ferrari venture, and I think he'll be there for many years, more than people actually suspect to start with. Whereas for Leclerc, obviously his heart is completely in Ferrari as the team he wants to win with, and once you come out of the disappointment, he'll be banging that same rhetoric. But he's on his 7th season with the team. He's never been involved in a title battle. I mean, 2022, we can't really count it because Ferrari imploded and he ended up 150 points behind Max Verstappen. 7 seasons is a long time to not be in a title battle, especially when the years are ticking by. And I think that this season for him, obviously, I don't expect him to be looking to leave now, but with a huge rule change on the horizon, you never know, Ferrari might nail 2026 and have the fastest car at the start of the new regs. But he came into this year saying, if we don't win both titles, I'll be disappointed. And at this stage, unless Ferrari complete a miraculous turnaround, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. The car's just too inconsistent. Even from pre-season testing, you could see there was something wrong with the rear. The rear didn't inspire confidence in the drivers. And now I'm reading along the lines from some reports that the rear suspension is perhaps not rigid enough to allow the team to run the car lower to the ground, which is what you need for performance. In Lewis's case, the car might have been running too low to the ground with his plank getting worn. But yeah, they should have upgrades to Bahrain. It's being reported. They'll be hoping that'll have the same effect as their mid-season upgrades last year, because otherwise it looks like it's just going to peter out, and I think there will be frustrations there. And I don't expect them, to do their hire and fire policy and get rid of this, not with such a huge rule change on the horizon, but this is a massive blow to Ferrari, because we were all expecting them to be in championship contention, and it looks like probably on the balance of things, when you factor in a Max Verstappen-led Red Bull, they are probably the fourth best team.
Yes, I think, Max's heroics. I mean, he's second in the championship still, so he is really hauling that Red Bull team along. And like you say, I think last year, Ferrari had that period in the middle of the season where the upgrades took them down a bad path, but they operated in such a fashion that they mitigated that damage really well. And obviously things like the disqualification, when you're still finding your feet with this concept, you're unsure whether it is going to work. Disqualifications don't help, and it's not what we saw last year. Adding the decision in the rain in Melbourne as well, as you said. I think their saving grace could be the rule change, but we've seen in the past Ferrari not nail seismic rule changes. They did obviously make that strong start with 2022, but if we look at how they approached the 2014 rule changes, they really took a big step back. So, spent the sort of subsequent years trying to reclaim ground. They really don't have the ability to do that next year. They really need to nail it, especially if they're going to have difficulties this year understanding the 2025 car. But yeah, you mentioned Verstappen. And wow, Red Bull, it's like a polarizing situation, more so than ever before. It's obviously been the saga at Red Bull that Verstappen can handle what Red Bull throw at him. And at its best, it's winning 19 races in one single season. In its middling sort of situation we saw last year, it's winning only, a paltry 9 races or, something terrible like that, but winning the championship. And now I think we're seeing maybe the situation at its worst in terms of what's happening at Red Bull. Verstappen just complaining that all-round pace isn't there. He was shocked to be on the front row for the sprint. He was able to hold on to third in, Grand Prix. It was a bit more of a reality check for Red Bull. Verstappen, with all his talent, could only finish fourth in the Grand Prix and really looked just... They were absent, weren't they, really, in terms of the fight at the front. He was adrift in sixth, and it wasn't until, obviously, Hamilton converted to a two-stop and Leclerc faded at the end of the race, and the Red Bull got a bit more performance at low fuel that he was able to recover to fourth. But I mean, that's not really the biggest issue on Red Bull's hands. It's obviously the other side of the garage. We've seen Pierre Gasly struggle. We've seen Alex Albon struggle. We've seen Sergio Perez struggle, but maybe not quite as much as, admittedly, it's only 2 races, but those 3 drivers haven't struggled to the extent that Liam Lawson is right now. It's exacerbated, I think, by the fact that those other drivers struggled where Red Bull maybe had a more competitive car, especially in the case of Perez. But the Red Bull's not as competitive at the start of the season, and Lawson is really struggling to get into that very narrow window of performance, which meant qualifying last for the sprint and the Grand Prix in Shanghai. And already there being talk of him being demoted or swapped with Yuki Tsunoda, which, I mean, it's got to be gutting, isn't it, really, to see those speculations and to be part of that narrative. Myself personally, I think Lawson should maybe be given a bit more time, but maybe time isn't something that Red Bull can afford. And the biggest question is you take Lawson out of the car, you put someone else in, is the same issue going to happen? Like, what is happening at Red Bull with this car?
Yeah, it's the Marc Marquez Repsol Honda situation, isn't it? Where supreme talent can handle the machine, but everybody else who goes in alongside him just can't tame it. And I think Red Bull are in a massive conundrum here because, as you mentioned, I think Lawson does deserve time. Suzuka's a circuit he's driven at before. He was good in Super Formula there. He basically matched Tsunoda in race pace in his AlphaTauri standard in 2023. And then you've got Bahrain, which is obviously where he's tested. So it is two circuits that, there's not many excuses for him. But on the contrary, he's scored no points so far. While Verstappen sat second in the Drivers' Championship, 8 points behind Norris, Red Bull are third in the Constructors. I think it's 40-odd points, maybe 42 points behind McLaren already. So nearly a 1-2's worth of points behind McLaren. So, you can't afford too many more weekends like that. So they're in a really difficult position because it would be ruthless and it would be unfair on Lawson to be axed 2 races in. But also, Red Bull made their bed. Now they've got to lie in it. Nobody in their right mind should have expected Lawson to come in and hit the ground running. Not when, we know about the struggles Red Bull have had. It's clear it wasn't a Perez limited issue. Yes, Sergio didn't perform to the standard he should have done, but there's been historical evidence of that second seat across several generations of cars. Drivers can't handle it, and they're not bad drivers. We're seeing what Alex Albon's doing in the Williams. We've seen what Piastri can do in an Alpine. They are quality drivers who, for whatever reason, struggled in the Red Bull, and that's happening to Lawson. Red Bull should have expected this wholeheartedly. You don't put someone in there who had, 11 Grand Prix before his Red Bull debut up against Max Verstappen in a capricious car. It was never going to work out. I didn't think it'd be this bad. I don't think they expected it to be this bad. I imagine they would have thought, he'd be maybe, finishing P8, last of the front runners every weekend. But I think they can only have themselves to blame because they've created this situation. And the people at the top who have opted to promote Lawson into that seat, who now might be getting rid of him 2 races in, they should be held accountable because at the end of the day, Lawson's the one not doing the job in the car, but he's only doing what he can with the tools he's been given and the position he's been put in. It's a really hard one to call what they'll do because obviously there are reports that they are going to discuss the situation. I have a feeling it could be like a Perez summer break scenario where they review it, decide to give Lawson a bit more time, but I don't see how it's going to turn around. There's nothing we've seen from the first 2 weekends that you can cling on to where you think, oh, Lawson was quite good here. If he can just have this glimmer on a more consistent basis, there might be something there. There's been absolutely nothing. Qualifying slowest was just the lowest of the low. And yes, Suzuka, yes, it's high speed circuit, different characteristics to China, but all I can see is another similar weekend, probably a Q2 position at best. And just because it's a triple header, they might give him Bahrain and Saudi Arabia as well. But unless Lawson does a miraculous turnaround, I think it's inevitable at this stage that he won't see out the season. And it's just a question of who they put in. And it does look like it will be Tsunoda or at long last, more out of convenience than them actually choosing him because they want him in the car.
Yeah, firstly, it's horrible to see a driver, obviously, who came into F1 in his 2 stints showing a lot of promise, to see him obviously dejected in those post-session media engagements isn't nice to see for any driver. Second, if they put Tsunoda in, the same problems happen. They're really stuck because then they've basically run out of drivers because Isaac Hadjar's
they'll have to look at themselves then, won't they?
Hadjar's a rookie. Their next up is Lindblad. He's an F2 rookie, and he's not even 18 yet. They'll have to start. We've hearing rumours that they're sort of maybe making inquiries with Alpine in terms of their reserve driver pool, which is extensive and that is full of talented drivers. But again, not necessarily a solution. Third, we've heard this talk that even in 2023 they saw issues with the car, and the issues became clear last season. But it's interesting that there was talk of trying to make the car more drivable, but it doesn't seem like they've succeeded in opening up this operating window with the RB21. And you've got to think what the technical team at Red Bull, should they have not been putting a bit more effort into? It's easy for us to say, isn't it? But it doesn't look like they've succeeded in what they intended to do with the RB21, and they've made it slightly slower, maybe in terms of the competition. They've lost that all-round performance, but they haven't opened up the operating window to make. That's what they need to do. They need to make the car more compliant for two drivers, I think. And that once they do that, then the situation is going to resolve itself. I also agree with you that they'll probably give Lawson time, similar to what they did with that Perez sort of talks they had at the end of the summer break. It's a shame as well. I think the way, obviously, his career before Red Bull always came in the second half of an F1 season. So all his F1 experiences, Zandvoort later in the calendar. That is a long, long time away from where we are now. I think Zandvoort is something like round 14, 15, it's around that ballpark, isn't it? We're at round 2. Yeah. There's so many circuits that he hasn't done in an F1 car that they're not going to have that comparison, or he's not going to have that experience to rely on. So yeah, I think, as you say, it's not really a matter of if, is it? It's a matter of when, which is a shame. But he could go into that Racing Bulls car and then start to flourish, which we've seen happen before. And then it could kickstart his career off in a different direction, where it would leave Tsunoda if he goes into the Red Bull and struggles, and the Honda connection ending. That's a completely different question, would take a long time to answer. And, it would, again, he's having a really strong start to the season, Tsunoda. It would be a shame to see him go into the Red Bull and have that sort of extinguished. But,
yes, yeah. The other problem they've got now is that if Tsunoda doesn't work out, as you say, they're limited on options, because Hadjar will be a disaster. He's just started his F1 career. He's very raw. Lindblad, as you mentioned, in F2, highly spoken about, but definitely not ready for a Red Bull seat in F1. And then you look externally, the poorer drivers they could take, there's no glittering standout name who you would go if they need to get, like for Perez, at the end of 2020, he was on the market. He was doing great in that racing point. Deserved to be on the grid, deserved a second crack at a top team. It was the no-brainer decision. Now, there's no drivers out there you go, Red Bull, and go get them. I mean, Piastri's now signed a new deal with McLaren. And also, these top drivers, they're not going to want to go into the team that's built around Verstappen, having seen what these other drivers are suffering with. Okay, yes, people like Leclerc, Russell, etc., they'll back themselves over Gasly, Albon. But when you see what these drivers have experienced at Red Bull, it's a poison chalice. So you wouldn't want to go anywhere near that seat. Red Bull had the opportunity to take Carlos Sainz, which, in hindsight, they probably should have done, not because he necessarily would have thrived in that environment, because I think the issues Red Bull have got would actually bring the worst out of Sainz. The mid-corner understeer that RB21 has, Sainz, we saw at the 2022 Ferrari, he's not good with a twitchy rear end. So I don't think Sainz's strengths would be amplified in that Red Bull environment. I think he would also struggle to match Verstappen, but he'd also be an experienced enough hand to get on with the job, and I'm sure he'd work through it. He was available. He was willing to go up against Verstappen because it was his sole chance to be in a top team. They've now wasted that. They can't fall back on it. Who is out there that they could go for? Apparently they have an option on Alex Albon, but if you're Albon, why would you return to Red Bull when you're with a Williams team and you're doing really well, and your position's secure, you're on a long-term contract, the team's on an upward trajectory? I just don't see who the options are out there. I think Red Bull have made a real mess of the situation now.
Yeah, I think, in terms of seasoned drivers that are available, you've got to say Valtteri Bottas is probably, he's the most experienced and the most sort of, I guess, successful F1 driver on the market. So if things really do go, awry, they could call upon his services. I think the Daniel Ricciardo ship sailed, but who knows? You never know. They may bring him back. And that'll be a real end to his story. They brought him back to do maybe the last 4 races of the season in a Red Bull or what have you. They have limited their options. You never know. Lawson may pull himself out of this issue, or Tsunoda will get the call, and Tsunoda might, actually get on with it. It's an interesting one. There's a lot of ifs at the moment. The only fact we know at the moment is they're struggling, and we don't know how they're going to pull themselves out of it. But I guess, as with everything, time will reveal all the answers to the Red Bull predicament. Let's move on to the midfield, where I think there's some more positive stories that occurred. One being Haas, really turning their fortunes around after a tricky is an understatement, pretty torrid weekend in Australia, propping up the rear of the field, and all the question marks like, where's Haas's pace gone? Why have they got the slowest car? Yada 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 yada. Boom, double points finish in Shanghai. Aided obviously by the Ferrari disqualification and Pierre Gasly being disqualified for being underweight. Ocon finishing 7th on the road after having a strong qualifying, a strong start to the race, but then being promoted up to 5th. With the disqualifications, and Behrman doing the alternate strategy, starting on the hard tyre, putting on the mediums. I think in a 12-lap stint, he passed 4 cars. Racing Bulls pitted their 2 teams, and then the disqualifications, he got his first point as a full-time F1 driver. So a great story there for Haas. Williams, again, looking strong. They've already matched their points tally from 2024 with 17 points. They got a double points finish. Albon performing well once again. Sainz lucky with the disqualifications and the 2 stopping Racing Bulls to get 10th in his first Williams point. But the Spaniards struggling to adapt to the FW47. So some good stories there in the midfield. And we touched on it there. Racing Bulls could have got a double points finish, but they chose to 2-stop when everyone around them was 1-stopping. Everybody knew that it was going to be a 1-stop race at that point in the race, but Racing Bulls stuck to maybe a pre-race plan that was a little bit outdated by the time they executed it. So that cost them dearly because their car does look very strong. Obviously, Yuki picking up 3 points in the sprint, both cars in Q3 for Grand Prix qualifying. But yeah, Haas really turning things around. Williams pushing on from a strong season opener, albeit with Sainz looking for improvement, and Racing Bulls being their own worst enemy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the perfect summary. I mean, with Racing Bulls, it's throughout their name changes in recent years, it's been the same story, really. They can build a quick car, but they don't tend to maximise it. And when the margins are so fine this season, that's one thing you can't afford to do. You have to feel for Tsunoda. I mentioned it last week, with him potentially, if he doesn't get that Red Bull seat, still looking elsewhere on the market. He wants to have results to his name, and he could have had 2 headline results from the first 2 races instead of all he's got is a sprint 6th place to bank on. And this could come back to bite them. We saw last year they started with a really quick car, head in the midfield, and then things went awry. There's no guarantees in this business that just because you have a quick car now, it's all well and good them saying, oh, but the car's quick, we need to just tidy up a few things and we'll be flying, because the balance of power could change so quickly in this sport that come, mid-season, they might be struggling to score points. And then at that moment in time, you're then looking back at these over 2 races and going, if only we had these points to bank on, we'd be much higher in the championship. And that's got to be one fear in their minds, especially, with what happened last season. But Tsunoda's driving really, really well. Helmut Marko said he's seen a different Tsunoda this year, a more mature one, which maybe he's come with the territory of being the team leader. Him and Hadjar seem to have a really good relationship going on, working together really well. And Hadjar, like we saw in Australia, he's got that raw speed. He may be a bit rough around the edges, but that's to be expected of a rookie. But he's got the speed, and we talked about Tsunoda, his career being uncertain. You have to say Hadjar's was coming into this year as well. I know he hadn't even made a Grand Prix start, but we know what the Red Bull group's like when it comes to drivers. They can be very cutthroat. And with Lindblad being spoken up highly, doing a TPC run, I think in one of the old AlphaTauri cars at Imola before the season started. If it came to Tsunoda solidifying his place as the team leader in the kind of like the Pierre Gasly mold, alongside a more junior driver, Hadjar, if he didn't perform, he could have been under pressure. So the fact that he's already impressed Helmut Marko and Red Bull with these early performances bodes well for him. And it's a shame that he doesn't have a point to his name to reflect that. And it's not down to him. It's purely down to Racing Bulls. But yeah, the peak of their car is very strong. It's hard to say who has the edge out of them and Williams on peak performance. I think we have to go to a few more circuits to really get a gauge on that. But I think Williams have the most consistent car in the midfield and the most consistent drivers as well, because we've seen Albon really stepping up to the plate while Sainz has struggled. All the talk going into the season was that the Spaniard would have the upper hand, but actually it's been Albon who's far and away the best driver at Williams, and it's been really carrying that team to some great heights.
Yes, yeah, I think Sainz said that he's never really experienced a performance swing like this because he felt comfortable in testing, even in stages in Australia, but then China, the pace wasn't there, and he also said he's puzzled by it. But yeah, Albon rising to the challenge of Sainz being at Williams. Obviously, he knows the quirks of a Williams car well by now. But yeah, I think you can bank on Sainz. He's the thinking man's driver, isn't he? You can bank on him figuring this out and improving. And it's interesting. He said that in testing, didn't he? He said he didn't have the time, the answers to know what the Williams was like on the limit. Maybe that is what's holding him back at this early stage. With Haas, obviously they've got two quite polarizing results in terms of a Grand Prix spent at the back of the field in Australia, almost in every session, to then coming around through a double points finish in China. Would you say that which one of those is the anomaly? Where do you see Haas moving forward?
I think you have to take a combination of the both and say they sit in the middle. Komatsu said that, yes, we take this result, it's boosted them up the table. They're 14 points after 2 rounds. If you said to us before the season you'd have 14 points in 2 rounds, they'd be very happy with that. But the way it's come about, there is obviously problems with the car. They haven't made any changes with parts or whatnot to say that the problems they had in Australia won't rear their head again. And I think it will be very circuit dependent, very much like their engine supplier Ferrari, which is quite ironic considering the relationship between the two. Their performance will be tied to the track characteristics and the weather conditions rather than having that stable base like Williams seem to have.
Alpine don't look like they're able to really compete in that midfield pack quite as readily as they did towards the end of last season. I think we all expected Alpine to be at the forefront of the midfield battle, but they've really not shown that they can do that at this stage in a double Q1 exit as well in qualifying. It looks like they've taken some steps back compared to where they finished in 2024. I mean, almost I'd put them maybe behind Aston Martin. Lance Stroll's ahead of both Ferrari drivers in the drivers' standings. Just by quietly going around his business and not making any glaring mistakes. And then Sauber, that looked like, there was some promise maybe in Australia with Sauber moving forward, Hulkenberg getting that 7th place finish, Bortoleto getting out of Q1. But then, I mean, their race unravelled from the start, didn't it? And it looks like they've got a difficult car to drive, which is not what you want. So it looks like, maybe Sauber's 2024 troubles have come back. But yeah, interesting to see Alpine not in the front of that midfield picture, I think, and less surprises, I say, with Aston Martin and Sauber's performance.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even as if, testing showed that Alpine might be in trouble. They genuinely look quite strong in testing. The consensus was that it would be Williams and Alpine at the head of the midfield, scrapping over the remaining points behind the front runners, but it's not materialised like that. They've said over the weekend they were very, forthright in saying that with the media rear wing clamp down on flexible rear wings, that they've had to make changes. They were open about that. How much of an impact is that going to have over the coming rounds? Should have had points in Australia, but they didn't capitalise compared to their midfield rivals, and then they didn't look on the pace in Shanghai. It is a worry because they did look like they turned a corner at the end of last year. And over the winter, you had Flavio Briatore saying about how they want to challenge for wins in 2027. Talk about championships as well. We've heard this before with the Renault-owned squad so many times that they set a target and then it just doesn't come to fruition. And it's all well and good saying we're going to capitalise on the regulation change, but if they're not even showing they can head the midfield under this rule set with the current crop of engineers they've got, what confidence can you take from them making these outlandish statements about their future prospects? I just don't. If with all the momentum at the end of last year, I really thought we'd see them push on, and with Pierre Gasly in the form of his life, really pushing for P5 in the championship, which going into 26 might be the ideal, position for them to be in. But as you say, it looks like their lower midfield. We'll have to wait for a few rounds to progress to the varying track characteristics of the few rounds. It's a bit of a quirky calendar, but considering where we thought they'd been testing, they've definitely flattered to deceive.
Yes, I think one good thing you could say from Alpine is in terms of qualifying in Shanghai, particularly Jack Doohan looked to be quite close in terms of pace with Pierre Gasly, and there was all that talk, wasn't there, around Doohan before he even started his full rookie season. But he beat Gasly in sprint qualifying, and he was only a 10th off of him in Grand Prix qualifying. Yes, the races didn't go as well for Doohan, but that's a sign of encouragement for him in 2 rounds into his F1 career, or 3 actually, if we consider the Abu Dhabi stand-in or an early start. And it's a weird situation, wasn't it, that one? Yes, and Sauber, I don't know if you've seen, or if our listeners and viewers have seen the onboard of Hulkenberg's lap 1 in the Grand Prix, but that was a car that didn't want to go where he was putting it, to put that mildly.
No, and it's not as if he's a rookie who's still getting to grips with it. I know, obviously, it's a new car for him and changed teams, but he's a very experienced driver. It does look like their points return in Australia was a bit of capitalising on the conditions and circumstances rather than genuine pace. They do look improved compared to last year, because you must say in qualifying we've seen, I think, both Bortoleto and Hulkenberg in the opening 2 rounds make it through to Q2. So over a single lap, they're not cut adrift. They can mix it with the rest of the midfield, but it's like what the midfield drivers say about the top teams in the race, where the downforce kind of gap shows. And I think that's the case with Sauber. And whereas in previous seasons, banking that 7th place in Australia, getting 6 points on the board might be enough to earn you a position in the championship, with how competitive the midfield is and how much it's fluctuating, all the teams look competitive. I know Sauber are above Racing Bull and Alpine at the moment, but you'd have to say that's a false position. Racing Bulls, if they get it together on strategy, they'll jump ahead of Sauber. Alpine, unless this flexi wing clampdown really does impact their pace drastically, you think they'd, especially with Gasly, get ahead of Sauber. So I don't think the Himmel base squad can bank on that 7th place in Australia be enough to make a huge difference in the championship. They're going to need to find more gains. But it looks like their attention will very quickly switch to 2026, and rightfully so, with the Audi project on the horizon.
Yeah, I agree. Probably the right decision. I'm going to take the positive look again. As you said, in qualifying, they're able to mix, and it does look like they're closer, even if they are sort of more found out in racing conditions. It is, proof that the pack is as tight as it really can be in Formula One at the moment. But we've got bit more time to digest now. No more back-to-back. We've got a little, a weekend off from Formula One before we go into a triple header of Suzuka, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, where I'm sure we're going to find more answers to the questions we have now, and then more questions to answer following those races. So I think that's maybe a good place for us to end our conversation on the Chinese Grand Prix. And motorsport fans and Motorsport Week fans, you can look forward to 2-wheeled action this weekend with MotoGP and World Superbikes. MotoGP at the Circuit of the Americas and World Superbikes at Portimao, where Ducati, I don't know if anybody has noticed my jumper, for those watching and not just listening, Ducati will be fighting on both fronts there, I'm sure. But, in the meantime, like and subscribe to the podcast. Keep up to date with Motorsport Week and Motorsport Monday. And make sure you follow us on socials at Motorsport Week on X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. I believe I've named them all there. Thank you for joining us. Taylor, thank you for joining me. And goodbye.